If you're following the India-China relationship these days, there's a contrasting picture that's being painted. On one side, you have Indian officials, including External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar, visiting China, talking about a normalization, an improvement in the India-China relationship. On the other hand, you're seeing a number of worrying reports. Firstly, of industrial sanctions being placed on Indian companies, of expanded Chinese territorial claims in Arunachal Pradesh, and even China's military providing a supporting role to Pakistan in Operation Sindoor. What picture does that paint of the India-China relationship? Where is India's relationship with China headed? To answer those questions, I have with me Professor Jabin Jacob, who's at Shiv University, also the director of the Center for Himalayan Studies, which focuses greatly on China, really one of India's most eminent sinologists. Professor Jacob, thank you so much for joining us here on HT. I laid the problem question in front of you. We're seeing these contrasting signals, the government asking for normalization and improvement in ties, but also these very worrying reports that we're seeing about China's activities towards India. What sort of picture does that paint for you about the India-China relationship?
Well, thank you, Shashank, for having me on the show. I think first and foremost, we must understand what has not been achieved, since 2020, since the Galwan crisis. As the army chief said last year, a degree of standoff continues. Or rather, he said it actually a few months ago. A degree of standoff continues despite the disengagement. So issues such as the de-escalation of troops, that is, withdrawal to locations away from the LAC, away from the sites of dispute on the LAC, and the de-induction of troops, none of this are being talked about anymore. So in effect, what we have is that the resolution of the situation, the complete resolution of the situation post-Galwan, has been pushed to the sidelines. Now, having said that, this is in no way, this doesn't in any way suggest that India is India is ignoring the security threat from China. I think, especially post Operation Sindoor, I think the Indian security establishment is particularly on its toes because of Sino-Pak collusion in the military sphere, as you just pointed out. Now, frankly, the government is without options. The relationship or what the government does with respect to China is not only to do with what the state of India-China relations on the border, but we also have to pay attention to the larger global context. The return of Trump to power has sort of complicated India's calculations, I think, on this relationship. So, status quo ante, the return to status quo ante, before the Galwan crisis is no longer talked about. We have returned to diplomatic parleys, I think, which is frankly the easy way out. But even so, I think some positive steps have been made. I think the return to renewal of visas between the two countries, I think that's important. We need to keep people-to-people exchanges as open as possible. I think next we will have maybe direct flights, the return of journalists. But yeah, overall, I don't think we've moved much in terms of achieving our goals with respect to normalization as we originally defined it post-Galwan. Now what we're calling normalization is just sort of dealing with the difficulties in the international context as well.
Professor Jacob, could I ask you, in terms of the context of the border, I've talked to some people who say that, yes, you're right, we have not returned the status quo on the border, but this was expected. We, as Foreign Secretary Vijay Gokhale said, we are going to be living in a state of armed coexistence now moving forward. And we have to simply accept that going back to what used to be the case in the Border Peace and Tranquility Agreements, what happened pre-April 2020 when Chinese forces moved across the northern sector of the line of actual control, that is a reality that simply no longer exists. We will simply have to accept what exists on the border right now. And that's the game we're going to have to play over the next couple of years. Status quo is not going to be restored. Your sense?
Yeah, I agree. I don't think status quo is going to be restored anytime soon. My only concern with this approach is one, there is a tendency also to push the entire set of causes that led to this state of affairs to the sidelines. We don't yet have a full accountability exercise post-Galwan. Why did it happen? Is there? I mean, there is no real audit or an assessment of our responses, whether they were appropriate, whether we could have done something better, whether we did something wrong. None of that has actually happened. So the problem with this kind of normalization is that that accountability exercise is missing. Second, we also need a larger assessment of the treaties that you just mentioned, that Ambassador Gokhale just mentioned, about all these 93 agreement, 96 agreements, the 2005 agreement. I mean, how relevant are those treaties anymore? We can talk about protocols for when the troops run into each other. You can say that these protocols are in place, but I think if anything, Galwan proved that nothing is sacrosanct. These protocols can be ignored at any time. So, what is our response going to be when this happens again? So, I think that really is the crux of the matter. Uh, while we have all of these agreements on paper, nobody really believes that they will be followed. Even in words, let alone spirit, anymore. So I think that's really the catch, and that's an assessment. I mean, that is really not that assessment and that audit is not really dependent on the Chinese. That's something, that's an internal exercise. That's an exercise that we in India need to be able to do at the government level, in the public domain. And unless that happens, we are going to continue to run out of options when the Chinese push us, and the Chinese will continue to keep pushing us.
We've also seen really across the board the Chinese undertake this phenomenal infrastructure buildup in on the border. There's this border villages program that they're pushing. We also, of course, have our vibrant villages program, which is basically to push closer and closer to the border settled areas. There's also talks of greater rail links that the Chinese are building up to connect, for example, Chengdu, the Lhasa, and also, of course, boosting connectivity between mainland China as well as the border regions. We've also seen a diminishing balance of air power in on the border. There's a lot of concerns there. What do you think the Indian government needs to do? And of course, I'll move into other questions in the India-China relationship. But what needs to be the approach moving forward now on the border? Because it does seem like the Chinese have settled into this much more competitive view of the border with India.
Look, it isn't rocket science. I think the Indian establishment, the security establishment, the military establishment, they've all know what needs to be done. The problem is the pace of the doing. And frankly, the pace has picked up, especially post Galwan, and I think now post Operation Sindoor. I think we are very, very cognizant of our shortcomings, the gap in capabilities, and what needs to be done. I think from the outside, as somebody who's just looking at open source material, um, and the way the current normalization is proceeding, there is this tendency. There is this sort of sense that the normalization is not being driven really by factors in our control, that we are sort of being pushed along or carried by the tide, as it were, due to external as well as internal circumstances. So I think that really is the problem. We need to be able to conduct this normalization at our pace, with matters in our control. But if, say, Indian businesses are very keen to open to the exclusion of all other factors, then we have a problem. There needs to be communication between both within the government as well as between government and other sections of Indian society. India, to ensure that everybody is on board when we talk about normalization with China, because normalization obviously is not going to be a full opening up. I mean, there is too much suspicion, too much water has passed under the bridge for us to be able to, go back to things as they were. So at every stage now, we have to think very carefully about the consequences of opening up, about the consequences of a decision made, and whether these decisions can be rescinded, whether the opposite side can backtrack. So, in that sense, we have to be extremely careful. So I would say that uh, that degree of clarity, I mean, that's not really available, at least to the public, to the general public, from what the government is doing. And when something with Pakistan happens, immediately all attention goes away from China, except in this sort of broadly military aspect. But there are other aspects about China that are simply ignored. And essentially now with what's happened in Pahalgam, I think everybody's forgotten about Galwan. And I think that's a real danger. If attention to China is only episodic, we are in trouble for the longer term.
Right. I remember that we had spoken even a year or two back, and now I want to shift to maybe the economic side of the relationship. You had been very early on, even when tempers were running high, especially with the conflict with China. You had actually argued for a common sense policy on economics. You had said that, look, visas for businesses looking to get Chinese workers make sense. Some investments in limited non-strategic sectors also make some sense. We should not have this blanket broad brush policy on Chinese investments because we need that. If it helps our economic growth, why should we block it? So there is that argument, and it has gained currency, as you're saying, with Indian businesses. There's the opposite end, which is saying that look at what the Chinese are doing on Foxconn. That was a story that got a lot of attention in India, pulling Chinese workers out of Foxconn, restricting the export of specialized equipment. We've seen the restriction of exports of to basically stop China from India from developing its iPhone manufacturing supply chain. We've seen reports of specialized fertilizer being restricted as well. And so the question is, it seems very much, and again, I refer to the piece written by former Foreign Secretary Vijay Gokhale, who said that, in fact, this does look like a policy of quiet industrial sanctions being applied against India. So my question is, India wants to develop. Chinese investments could definitely help in that, but it seems that the Chinese government is playing another game as well at the same time. So what is going on here? Could you make sense of that picture for us?
So again, this is not new. The Chinese have been engaged in this endeavor for a very long time. There's a reason why we have such a large trade deficit with China. It's not just that Indian small businesses or Indian businessmen are buying Chinese stuff in large quantities. It's also because they are not able to sell their products in China because of non-tariff barriers in the Chinese system. So for a very long time, and not just with India, but also with the Americans. So that's why, the Americans have finally woken up. Uh, you know, there has been a policy of, a zero-sum approach, a very mercantilist approach, as far as economic ties go, where the Chinese are concerned. But the thing is, from the time that we last spoke and today, my concern is that, you can't blame the government for everything, the Indian government for everything. Indian businesses also need to sort of wake up and realize that there is an onus on them as well to prepare and to anticipate trouble. So I'm just shocked that Indian businesses who saw Galwan happen, who know, who've been, well, who should have been following what the foreign minister was saying, have not prepared for this eventuality. I mean, if you don't prepare, obviously, the other side is going to, ask for a higher price. And I'm sure the Chinese will still, deal and sell to you, but at a higher price. That's all. And this is a market mechanism. And eventually, so two things can happen: either you don't prepare, and therefore you pay a higher price, or you let the market operate, and eventually other solutions, other sources will be found. And I think that is more or less what we are doing with respect to rare earths and so on. But this will take time. So the question is, in the interim, what do we do? And I don't see a solution in the interim, unless we pay a price, or we decide to tighten our belts and try and find some other alternatives. And now the question is, what is this interim? And I would say that even now it's not too late. Even now, if Indian industry were to wake up, to invest more in understanding China, how the Chinese economy operates. I think fundamentally Indian industry does not understand how the Chinese economy or the Chinese political system operates. And that's why they think that a deal is a deal. It simply isn't. Chinese enterprises are entirely controlled by the government, by the party state in China, and they are, beholden to the government there. They have to listen to everything that the government tells them, and it's not simply a matter of signing a contract or signing a deal, and therefore the Chinese will follow that. It simply doesn't happen that way. Indian industry simply doesn't understand this, and that speaks to a lack of investment in understanding China as a market, and as a a potential strategic competitor. Forget about in the military sphere, but even as an economic competitor, I don't think Indian industry has paid attention to this. So unless we fix that situation, unless the industry decides to invest in China studies, in studies of the Chinese economy, China's trade behavior around the world, this problem is not going to be resolved. The Indian government can only do and say so much. The Indian government's capacity itself is too little. The Indian government doesn't have enough people to engage with Indian industry. And of course, the different ministries often work at cross purposes. So, there's lack of coordination within the government. But that is, par for the course in all governments. But unlike in the US or in Europe, where businesses and industry associations invest a great deal in studying and understanding China, that doesn't happen in India.
Could I also ask you, broadly, I think you had made reference to this, but I would love for you to talk about it more, which is the Trump side of the equation, right? Which is that for the last 10 years, at least, perhaps even going back longer, the investment in the relationship with America has been a central pillar of India's foreign policy. It has been an element of strategic reassurance, even with the conflict with China. For example, in the Galwan Valley clashes, the Americans were quite present with military and intelligence support, according to reports that we know of. And so that was a level of reassurance that India had that, look, our partnership with America is a strong bulwark in case the Chinese decide to get a little too adventurous. Where does that leave us now with the Trump administration being what it is, being, shall I say, as unreliable as it is? Where does it leave India with respect to China? Because I, have done some reading about, scholars who basically postulate that, look, when India's relationship with America is strong, its external alignments are strong, China feels the need to accommodate India more on key issues. But now, with the American support and the announcement of tariffs that just took place today, there very much seems to be a lot of volatility in the relationship. How is China going to be looking at that development? Is it going to think of India as weaker and with a weaker bargaining hand simply because the relationship with America is not as strong as it was, say, 2 years ago?
Look, I think both things can be true at the same time. As scholars have argued, when India-US relations were good, the Chinese did feel constrained in many ways. Uh, you know, but I think the situation has also changed. This is true, really, of the early part of the 2000s. When the Chinese pushed BRICS and the Russia-India-China trilateral as a way to keep India more or less on even keel, neutral vis-a-vis the United States. But I think with the Xi Jinping regime, what's been happening is that it's become more black and white, the Chinese approach to the world, in the sense that there's also the argument that the Chinese have engaged in all these provocations with India precisely because India has been getting closer to the United States, and to tell the Indians, look, you can't do that. So, so in a sense, I think both are true. But to answer your specific question, at this point in time, given that the Trump administration is putting a lot of pressure on India in the economic realm, right? I wouldn't go so far as to say that India-US cooperation in the military realm is completely out, or that becomes a victim to what's happening on the economic front in the India-US relationship. But obviously, the most important, the most visible part of the relationship is what is happening on the economic front, and those are consequences that we can see in real time. So here, I'm sure, obviously, the Chinese are going to exploit it. I mean, it's a market economy. I mean, you see that your client has run out of other suppliers. You will obviously charge your client more for the supplies you make to your client. So I think that's just normal business practice. And really, I think the onus or the fault really lies at home. The fact that we did not prepare, we did not anticipate, and there is really no excuse for lack of preparation and lack of anticipation. I think people have been talking about this for a very long time. I mean, it's nobody's case that the Americans are going to do anything for India for free. I mean, this kind of altruism doesn't exist in international relations. So I don't see why anybody should be surprised that the Chinese should, put pressure on India because of what Trump is doing. The Chinese are also under pressure with Trump. But, they are cutting a deal. And, if their deal is better than what deal we get with the Americans, I think then it is the stuff of international politics that they will put pressure on India. So there's nothing to be surprised about here. And in fact, it speaks to also, I think, to come back to earlier point about how much Indian industry, Indian government invests in China studies, it also speaks very poorly of our understanding of American politics, that we, did not anticipate what Trump would do.
Right. Could I also ask you, and this is the meta question, maybe I should have started with this question, about where things started to go wrong in the India-China relationship. Until the mid-2000s, we continued to see a level of cooperation on border discussions. You had talk of China, that was very much in vogue at that point in time. A much more dovish view of, I wouldn't say perhaps dovish, but a non-hawkish view of China in the military and security establishments. And there was also a sense that these two countries, both rising together, would, of course, through platforms like the BRICS, be able to cooperate on issues like climate change, like the international economic order at the IMF, and so on. When did things begin to go wrong? When did, at least perhaps even in the Chinese mind, when did those problems begin to really surface? Was it 2013 when we started seeing border standoffs? What exactly went wrong? What changed in the Chinese mindset towards India that we now start to see this?
I mean, it's very difficult to say, things went wrong. I mean, you at any point in time, uh, you try and prepare, or you try and anticipate what might happen. And like I said, our preparation has generally been quite poor. But at that point in time, we are also, we're living in the unipolar moment. You're assuming that things are likely to progress, things are likely to get better. So in a sense, we sort of fell victim to this idea of linear progress in the relationship. But what is happening, or what was happening in China, is that China's power was increasing. China's net national power is increasing, and there was a lack of understanding of the nature of the Chinese regime itself. Under Xi Jinping, the worldview of the Communist Party, well, it's always been that, but I think it's become much more sharply zero sum, black and white. So if you're not with us, you're against us. So the Chinese began to see themselves in competition with the Americans. And with that, their entire attitude towards everybody else also changed, as to, trying to see, who is standing with us and who's standing with the Americans. So I think that, I mean, you can, I'm sure there are people in the system who understood that, but our response is also partly dependent on our resources. So you talked about the view within the Indian security establishment of, that things were getting better, of a much more or a much less hawkish view. I think partly that has to do with our lack of resources. I mean, what is the point of being a hardliner or hawkish if you simply do not have a defense budget to match? If you are not allowed to build up your military, you are not allowed to modernize your military. If you do not have the capacity, I mean, as somebody in charge, you're not going to G up your men and say, look, this is a threat, we got to be prepared for it. Because then your men are going to ask you, but prepare with what? Where are the resources to prepare for the threat from China? So, I mean, in that situation, you tend to take the easy way out, even at the highest levels of leadership, I'd imagine. So, I mean, I think this is just natural human nature. But I think, to sort of currently, at least, I think nobody's under any illusion that the so-called normalization in the India-China relationship extends to the military sphere or the security sphere. I think the situation on the border is going to be bad. It's just going to get, we will continue to have pressure on the border. What we saw in Eastern Ladakh, there's no reason to assume that it will not happen in the eastern sector, in the Arunachal area next. I mean, that's just the natural way that these things will progress. But I'd imagine that the Indian military is ready for it.
Right. Could I also ask you, in terms of the Chinese view of India, where does it stand now? Because we have seen a lot of reporting, a lot of writing about people talking about the Chinese view of India. And very much, when you speak to Chinese scholars, I'm sure you have much more experience with that. My interactions with them, there is often this sense of, yes, if the Americans and the West were not trying to inveigle India into this alliance, we would have a good relationship, sort of suggesting that India is in many ways part of the Western camp, that we have sort of been fooled into working with the West. And therefore, if we did not do that, we would have a much better relationship with the Chinese. So could you explain that view as well of India in the Chinese mind these days? Is it very much that, look, India is now part of the Western camp, and therefore we must treat it as such and put pressure on it accordingly? Your view again?
So, like I said, the Chinese view of the world has changed or sharpened. I mean, I think the view always existed that China wanted to be number one, that China was the Communist Party is in existential conflict with competing political systems. But under Xi Jinping, that view has become much more mainstream. They are much more confident about expressing that view. And India, I mean, look, the Indian economy is nowhere near the size of the Chinese economy. So the Chinese are looking at objective parameters. And from that point of view, I think they're entitled to their view that the Indians are small players or smaller players. And yet the Indians do not seem to acknowledge China's position in the hierarchy. And as long as that is the case, the Chinese will have this sort of antagonistic view of India. And let's also not forget that there is a long-standing boundary dispute. There is a Tibet issue at play here. So there are a lot of reasons for why the Chinese would, keep India at arm's length or be suspicious of India. And at different times, depending on the context, depending on the international situation, depending on the regional situation, those views will become sharper, more adversarial. And right now, because the Chinese are under pressure, there is some sense of, this detente between India and China cannot happen only if one side thought through. The Chinese are also obviously looking at it that they need to sort of open up to the Indians. They need to engage with the Indians because they're also under the pump a little bit. But the situation can change, and I suppose from the Indian perspective or the Indian government's perspective, it is also probably trying to wait out the Trump presidency and see, well, whether we can get back to some semblance of normalcy in the India-US relationship. Remember, the India-US relationship is also not normal.
Right.
So I think we need to sort of look at it that way as well.
Right. My last question to you, Professor Jacob, and I hate to ask you to indulge in crystal ball gazing, but I will, which is what will it take to move into a different dynamic in the India-China relationship? It's been suggested that some combination of faster Indian economic growth, not what we've been seeing so far, but a faster clip of economic growth, a natural slowdown in the Chinese economy, given some of the problems that they're having, including declining labor forces, population troubles, and so on, and a combination of increased American pressure on the Chinese, in fact, a focus strategy. A combination of these three things might force the Chinese to perhaps look differently at India or perhaps improve that relationship. What is your view? I don't want to presuppose what you'll say. What is your view? What will it change? What will it take to move the two countries into a different dynamic?
Look, I mean, a litany of Chinese troubles, as a way of expressing hope that we can deal with China. I mean, it's just this is not going to work. I mean, if you take the demographic angle, yes, the Chinese population is declining and so on and so forth. But if the Indian population is growing, we have to ask the question, whether the Indian population is being equipped for the new century, for the years ahead. What is the level of education? What's the level of health, etc. So, I mean, the demographic dividend is not a given in India. So, I think we have to be very careful trying to uh, use China's problems as an opportunity for us to somehow catch up. I mean, that policy by default, it simply doesn't work. I think the changes need to be internal. It doesn't matter whether China is rising, China is declining. I think the onus is on us to be able to do something about us catching up. Okay, and often, like with nuclear issues, everybody doesn't have to match missile for missile, weapon for weapon. Deterrence will still exist if you exhibit capability. And right now, we are not in a position to exhibit capability in key sectors. Frontier technologies, AI, or any e-commerce or electric vehicles. We are nowhere in the picture in many of these things. I mean, we have a lot of startups and so on and so forth. There's a lot of work going on, but scaling it up to the degree that China has, that's when we will get into the act. And unless we get there, I mean, this is all about internal balancing. I really don't care what the external world looks like. what we can do at home, I don't think we are doing enough of. You know, I mean, we don't seem to have enough accountability in the system. You know, we have these processes, we have these plans, we have these goals, but what is coming of it, I don't see that happening. So I think that really is my primary concern. Ultimately, it's for us to do internally, despite whatever else might be going on externally.
Understood. Professor Jabin Jacob of Shiv University, always frank, always candid with his opinions of India as well as China. Professor Jacob, thank you so much.
Thank you, Shashank.